He thought he was ending a marriage. He was actually ending himself, and he wouldn't understand that until it was far too late to stop it. Weston Marsh stood at the head of a glass conference table in a law office 40 floors above Chicago, watching his wife sign away 17 years of her life without so much as raising her eyes from the page. He'd expected tears. He'd expected pleading. What he got instead was silence, steady and unreadable, the kind of silence that should have terrified him if he'd been paying attention. He wasn't. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the window behind her, already rehearsing the phone call he planned to make the moment this was over. Because in exactly 9 minutes, Weston Marsh believed he would walk out of that room a free man. A younger, richer, unshackled man. What he did not know, what he could not have known because he had never once bothered to read the documents that built the empire bearing his family name, was that somewhere in a filing cabinet 3 floors below him sat a single page that would turn his victory into the most expensive mistake of his life. He was about to find out that some marriages don't end when the papers are signed. Some of them just begin their real business. To understand how a pharmaceutical heir with a 9-figure fortune ended up losing everything to the wife he'd spent a decade humiliating, you have to go back to where Marsh Pharmaceuticals actually came from. Because the story Weston told at galas was not the true one. Weston liked to say the company was built entirely by his father, a chemist-turned-entrepreneur who mortgaged his soul to launch a generic drug manufacturer out of a rented warehouse in the early 90s. That part was true. What Weston left out, always conveniently, was the part where his father's warehouse nearly collapsed under debt in year 3, and the only reason it didn't was a private loan from a quiet, unassuming family of real estate investors, the Whitlocks. Adrienne Whitlock was 19 years old when her grandfather cut that check. She grew up watching him structure deals the way other kids watched cartoons, learning early that real power in business was rarely loud. It was buried in paperwork nobody bothered to read twice. She met Weston Marsh a decade later at a fundraising dinner, back when he was still just the ambitious son trying to prove he could run the family company better than his father had. She was sharp, composed, and crucially, she was a licensed real estate attorney who had spent 3 years drafting commercial property agreements before she ever set foot in Weston's world. He found her intelligence charming at first. Later, he'd find it inconvenient. Eventually, he'd find it invisible, because Weston had a particular gift. He could look directly at competence and simply choose not to see it, especially in a woman he'd already decided to underestimate. They married young. Adrienne stepped back from her firm to help manage the Marsh family's expanding real estate holdings, including, quietly, the 90-year lease structure on the land beneath the company's original headquarters. A detail buried so deep in decades-old paperwork that even Weston's own general counsel had stopped thinking about it. Nobody in that boardroom knew that the land the entire Marsh empire physically sat on had never technically belonged to the Marsh family outright. It had belonged since 1994, to a discreet holding trust controlled by the Whitlocks, the same family whose granddaughter Weston now referred to, in front of his mistress, as dead weight. He didn't remember that detail. He'd never bothered to remember it. And that single, arrogant blind spot was about to cost him everything he owned. The affair wasn't even Weston's first. It was just the first one he stopped hiding. Her name was Sienna Cole, 26 years old, a marketing consultant the company had brought on for a rebrand 18 months earlier. Adrienne found out the way most betrayed spouses find out. Not through a confession, but through a series of small inconsistencies that eventually stopped making sense unless she stopped pretending not to notice them. She didn't scream. She didn't confront him in a restaurant, didn't throw a glass of wine, didn't do any of the things Weston, deep down, almost wanted her to do, because at least that would have made him feel like the main character in his own story. Instead, Adrienne did something far more dangerous. She got quiet. For 6 months she said nothing. She smiled at company dinners. She hosted the holiday party. She let Weston believe, completely, that she either didn't know or didn't care. And in doing so, she bought herself exactly the amount of time she needed to make one phone call that would change the entire trajectory of both their lives. She called her cousin Marcus Whitlock, who now managed the family's original trust, the very trust that still, on paper, owned the ground lease beneath Marsh Pharmaceuticals' headquarters and 2 of its manufacturing facilities. "I need to know something," she told him over the phone. sitting alone in a parked car outside her own house, the porch light glowing behind her like a stage set for a life she no longer wanted. If Weston and I divorce, and the marital settlement transfers the residence and the associated commercial holdings out of joint ownership, does that trigger the reversion clause? There was a long pause on the line. Adrienne, Marcus said slowly, are you asking me if divorcing him hands you the building? I'm asking, she said, if divorcing him hands me the ground his entire company is standing on. The answer, buried in 90-year-old legal language nobody at Marsh Pharmaceuticals had reviewed since the Clinton administration, was yes. Weston filed for divorce first. A detail he would repeat proudly to anyone who'd listen, as if beating your spouse to the courthouse were some kind of trophy. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state, a man named Foster Grant who billed $900 an hour, and had a reputation for leaving spouses with nothing but their dignity, and sometimes not even that. Weston wanted Adrienne gone quickly, quietly, and cheaply. He wanted the house. He wanted full control of the company. And more than anything, he wanted the world to see him walking into his 40th birthday party with Sienna on his arm instead of the boring, aging wife who'd stopped trying. As he'd described Adrienne to a colleague just weeks earlier, unaware, or unbothered, that his own assistant was standing close enough to hear it. The settlement negotiations dragged for 4 months. Weston grew impatient. He wanted it done before the company's next investor conference. Wanted to present himself as a man moving confidently into a new chapter rather than a man mid-collapse. So when Adrienne's legal team, quiet, methodical, almost suspiciously agreeable, proposed a settlement that gave Weston the house, the vehicles, full operational control of the company, and 90% of the liquid assets, Foster Grant nearly fell out of his chair with relief. She's not even fighting for the company, Foster told Weston during their final prep call. She's asking for the guest property in Wisconsin and a modest cash settlement. Frankly, Weston, I'd sign this before she changes her mind. Weston didn't ask why his wife, a woman who had once negotiated 7-figure real estate deals before he'd even met her, was suddenly acting like she didn't understand the value of what she was giving up. He should have asked. That question, the one he never bothered to voice, was the single thread that could have unraveled the entire plan sitting quietly beneath his feet. Instead, he signed. The signing took place on a Tuesday morning in October, in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown law firm. The kind of room designed to make people feel important right before it destroys them. Weston arrived 12 minutes late, sipping a coffee he hadn't offered to bring for anyone else, wearing a new suit that Sienna had picked out for him the week before. Adrienne was already seated when he walked in, hands folded, dressed simply, her face unreadable in a way that Weston mistook. The way he mistook almost everything about her, for defeat. You look tired, Addie, he said, settling into his chair with the casual cruelty of a man who'd stopped noticing his own cruelty years ago. This will be easier for both of us once it's over. You should be relieved. I know staying married to me was never really your strong suit. Adrienne didn't respond. She simply slid her pen across the table, uncapped it, and waited. For what it's worth, Weston continued, unable to help himself, unable to resist one final twist of the knife before walking away clean. Sienna actually understands what it takes to build something. You were always better at managing the house than the empire. Adrienne looked up at him then, not with anger, not with hurt, but with something far stranger. Something almost like pity. You're right, she said quietly. I was always better at managing the house. Weston laughed, delighted, mistaking her agreement for surrender. He had no idea he'd just described, with perfect and unknowing accuracy, exactly what she'd spent the last 6 months quietly reclaiming. He signed his name at the bottom of the settlement. Adrienne signed hers beneath it. And in that single, unremarkable motion, 2 signatures on a page neither of them read aloud, the ground beneath Marsh Pharmaceuticals legally shifted ownership for the first time in 30 years. Weston didn't feel it happen. He was too busy checking his phone for a text from Sienna. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Weston Marsh was standing in his corner office on the top floor of Marsh Pharmaceuticals headquarters, admiring the skyline, when his general counsel knocked on the door looking like a man who'd just been handed a diagnosis. We received a letter, the lawyer said, from Whitlock Family Holdings. Weston barely looked up. Ooh, they're claiming ownership of the ground lease beneath this building and the manufacturing facility in Ohio. And the lawyer hesitated. The residential property on Elm Ridge. Weston finally turned around. That's my house. According to this letter, the lawyer said carefully, it's currently titled under a trust that reverted to Whitlock family control the moment your divorce settlement finalized the transfer of joint marital property. Weston felt something cold settle in his stomach, the first genuine flicker of fear he'd experienced in years. That's impossible. My father built this company. This building has been ours since 1994, the lawyer interrupted gently. When your father borrowed heavily from the Whitlock family to keep the company afloat, and structured the land beneath it as long-term collateral inside a private trust. It's all here, Weston. Buried in an addendum nobody's looked at in decades. Weston sat down slowly, his mind racing back through every meeting, every closing, every rushed signature over the past 4 months, searching for the moment he might have missed something. He landed, inevitably, on one particular face. Adrienne, he whispered. The lawyer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Weston picked up his phone and dialed his ex-wife's number for the first time since the divorce, his hands shaking with a fury he hadn't felt in years. It rang twice. Then a message appeared instead of a voice. This number is no longer associated with Adrienne Marsh. Please contact Whitlock Holdings for all business inquiries. She had already changed her name back. She had already changed everything. While Weston was still trying to convince himself this was some kind of clerical error, Adrienne, now once again, Adrienne Whitlock, was 3 floors below the very building he still believed he controlled, sitting across from her cousin Marcus and a team of corporate attorneys, finalizing the paperwork that would transform quiet ownership into public control. You could have taken half of everything in the divorce, Marcus said, watching her review the final documents with the same calm precision she'd shown at 19 years old, sitting beside her grandfather during his biggest deals. Cash, investments, the house outright. Instead you asked for almost nothing on paper. Because on paper none of that mattered, Adrienne said, not looking up. The company was never really his to divide. It was built on land my family has controlled since before he ever proposed to me. He just never bothered to ask why the rent on his own headquarters was $1 a year. He's going to fight this, Marcus warned. Foster Grant doesn't lose gracefully. Adrienne finally looked up, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something flickered behind her calm. Not vengeance exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent a decade being underestimated, and was finally done pretending that was a weakness. Let him fight, she said. I've had 17 years to prepare for this exact moment. He's had 3 weeks to realize it's happening. By the following Monday, Whitlock Holdings had formally exercised its right, under the original 1994 trust agreement, to reclaim the underlying land beneath all 3 Marsh Pharmaceuticals properties. A right that, per the original loan structure, activated automatically the moment majority ownership of the associated marital residence changed hands outside the family. Weston hadn't just signed away his house. He had, without ever realizing it, triggered a 30-year-old dead man's switch buried inside his own father's most desperate business decision. Weston's first instinct was denial. His second was rage. His third, and this is where his arrogance finally began working against him in ways even he couldn't talk his way out of, was to ignore the entire situation and assume his legal team would quietly make it disappear. The way problems always seem to disappear for men like him. They did not make it disappear. 6 weeks after the initial letter, Weston received formal notice that Whitlock Holdings intended to enforce a rent adjustment on the land beneath Marsh Pharmaceuticals headquarters. From one symbolic $1 a year, the informal family arrangement his father had quietly maintained for decades, to full commercial market rate, retroactive to the date of the divorce settlement. The number attached to that letter made Weston's accountant physically leave the room to be sick. $14 million. Due within 90 days or the trust would begin formal eviction proceedings on the underlying land, which legally meant Marsh Pharmaceuticals' own headquarters building, full of employees, inventory, and decades of proprietary research, would need to be vacated or purchased outright at a valuation the company could not currently afford. Weston stormed into Foster Grant's office demanding answers, demanding lawsuits, demanding someone tell him how a page buried in his father's decades-old paperwork could possibly hold up in court. Because it's airtight, Foster said grimly, sliding the original 1994 document across his desk. Your father signed this willingly, in exchange for capital that saved this company from bankruptcy. And you signed a divorce settlement that unknowingly satisfied every trigger condition inside it. I've read it 4 times, Weston. There's no loophole. There's no argument. She didn't break any law. She just knew about a clause you didn't. Weston stared at his father's signature at the bottom of a page that suddenly felt less like ancient history, and more like a bomb with a 30-year fuse. She planned this, he said quietly. The whole marriage. She planned this from the beginning. Foster shook his head slowly. No, Weston. I don't think she planned the marriage. I think she planned the divorce. The second she found out about Sienna, she stopped being your wife and started being your landlord. The Marsh Pharmaceuticals board convened an emergency session 11 weeks after the divorce. And for the first time in company history, the meeting wasn't held in the headquarters boardroom Weston's father had built. It couldn't be. Whitlock Holdings had by then formally restricted access to non-essential personnel pending resolution of the land dispute, and Weston Marsh, technically, no longer qualified as essential. The meeting took place instead in a rented conference space 11 blocks away, a sterile, borrowed room that felt, to everyone in it, like exactly what it was, a company running out of ground to stand on. Weston arrived expecting sympathy from his board. What he found instead was 7 investors who had spent the last 2 months quietly reviewing their exposure, and a woman sitting at the head of the table who was not supposed to be there at all. What is she doing here? Weston demanded, his voice cracking with an anger that no longer intimidated anyone in the room. Miss Whitlock, said the board chairman, a man named Holloway who had known Weston since childhood and had never once, until this exact moment, imagined saying these next words aloud, has proposed a restructuring agreement that would resolve the land dispute in exchange for a controlling equity stake in Marsh Pharmaceuticals. Given the alternative, total loss of our operating facilities within 60 days, the board has voted, 11-1, to accept her terms. Weston's mouth went dry. You're giving her my company? We're saving the company, Holloway said quietly. Something you seem unable to do. Adrienne, seated calmly at the head of a table she had never physically occupied during her entire marriage, finally spoke. I'm not interested in punishing you, Weston, she said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only a terrible, exhausted honesty. I'm interested in making sure the 2,000 people who work here still have jobs next quarter. You made that difficult. I'm simply the only person in this room who thought ahead enough to fix it. Weston looked around the table, searching for one ally, one friendly face, one board member willing to stand up for the man whose family name was still stitched into the company's letterhead. He found none. He found only the quiet, collective exhaustion of people who had spent years watching him mistake charm for competence, and had finally run out of patience for the difference. This isn't over, he said, standing so abruptly his chair nearly toppled behind him. It actually is, Adrienne said softly. It's just not over the way you assumed it would be. Humiliated and cornered, Weston did what men like him almost always do when they finally run out of legitimate options. He reached for an illegitimate one. Buried inside Marsh Pharmaceuticals' research division was a compound years ahead of anything on the market, an experimental treatment for early-onset autoimmune disorders that the company had spent nearly a decade and $40 million developing. It wasn't public yet. It wasn't even fully patented. But Weston knew exactly what it was worth, and more importantly, he knew exactly who would pay top dollar for it without asking too many questions about where it came from. His name was Desmond Cole. No relation to Sienna, though Weston, in the fog of his own unraveling life, barely registered the coincidence. A rival pharmaceutical executive who had spent years trying and failing to poach Marsh's top researchers. Weston met him at a private airfield outside the city, carrying a flash drive containing years of proprietary research data he had no legal right to remove from company servers, let alone sell. You understand what you're asking me to buy, Desmond said, turning the drive over in his hand under the hangar lights. Stolen trade secrets from a company you no longer control. I built that research, Weston snapped. I hired the team that developed it. It's mine. Legally, Desmond said almost gently. It stopped being yours the moment the board voted you out this morning. Did nobody call to tell you? Weston felt the floor shift beneath him for the second time in 3 months. I called ahead, Weston, Desmond continued, setting the drive down on a nearby table rather than pocketing it. Right after your board reached out to warn every major player in this industry that you might try exactly this. Miss Whitlock offered me something considerably more valuable than a stolen drive. A formal licensing partnership on the treatment once it clears trials. Legally, publicly, profitably. Why would I risk federal charges buying something I'm already going to get to use anyway? Weston stared at him, uncomprehending, as headlights swept across the hangar entrance. 2 black sedans pulled to a stop outside, doors opening in unison. She knew, Weston whispered. She's known for a while, Desmond said almost sympathetically. You were never as unpredictable as you thought you were. The federal investigators who stepped out of those cars weren't interested in Desmond Cole. They were interested in the flash drive sitting on the table, and the man standing beside it who had just attempted, in front of witnesses and recorded audio, to sell stolen proprietary research to a competitor. Weston Marsh was arrested at 11:47 that night. 40 yards from a private jet, he no longer owned the right to board. The trial that followed became, briefly, a national business story. Not because of the amount of money involved, though $14 million in disputed land and $40 million in stolen research made headlines on their own, but because of the sheer, almost theatrical arrogance at its center. Financial journalists called it a masterclass in underestimation. One columnist wrote that Weston Marsh hadn't been outmaneuvered by his ex-wife so much as he had simply never noticed she was playing the same game he was, only better, and for much higher stakes. Weston's legal defense collapsed almost immediately. The recording from the hangar was damning. The paper trail connecting the stolen research to his private accounts was worse. His once loyal general counsel testified against him in exchange for immunity. Even Sienna, who had quietly distanced herself the moment Weston's assets were frozen, gave a brief, unflattering statement to investigators about conversations she'd overheard regarding, getting back what's mine before anyone can stop me. Adrienne did not attend the trial. She sent no statement, gave no interviews, made no public comment on her ex-husband's unraveling. While reporters camped outside the courthouse trying to catch a glimpse of the mysterious ex-wife behind the corporate reversal of the decade, she was 3 states away, quietly finalizing the licensing partnership that would bring Marsh Pharmaceutical's autoimmune treatment to market under new leadership. Her leadership, with a name that no longer included the word Marsh at all. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Weston was convicted on charges of attempted theft of trade secrets, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and wire fraud connected to funds he'd improperly diverted during the divorce proceedings. The judge, unmoved by his lawyer's argument that Weston had simply been a desperate man protecting his legacy, sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. As the bailiffs led him from the courtroom, Weston searched the gallery one final time, the way people always do in these moments, looking for someone who might still be watching, might still care enough to witness his ending. Adrienne wasn't there. She was 3 states away in a research lab, reviewing trial data for a treatment that would, within 18 months, begin changing the lives of thousands of children who had never heard either of their names. A year after the sentencing, the company formerly known as Marsh Pharmaceuticals reopened under a new name, Whitlock Ridge Biotech, in the same building Weston had once bragged about owning outright, standing on the same land his own father had quietly mortgaged away 30 years earlier to save a company he loved more than he understood. Adrienne didn't remove every trace of the Marsh family from the building. That wasn't the point, and she'd never been a woman motivated by erasure. She kept the research team Weston had actually hired well, kept the lab technicians who'd spent a decade developing treatments he never fully understood the value of, and quietly funded a scholarship in the original founder's name. Weston's father, the man who had built something real out of desperation, before his son inherited it and mistook inheritance for talent. She visited Weston exactly once, 18 months into his sentence, not out of cruelty and not out of guilt, but because some part of her needed to close a door she'd spent 17 years standing inside of. He looked smaller behind the visitation glass, the practice charm gone, replaced by something quieter and far more honest than anything she'd seen from him during their entire marriage. "You could have just taken the money," he said, picking up the phone slowly. "Half of everything. Any court would have given it to you. Why do all this instead?" Adrienne considered the question longer than he expected. "Because taking half would have meant I only wanted what was already yours," she said finally. "I didn't want half of something you built badly. I wanted to fix what you were about to destroy. The research, the jobs, the people who actually believed in this company before you turned it into a stage for your own reflection." "You ruined me," he said, and for the first time, it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like the beginning of understanding. "No, Weston," Adrienne said gently, standing to leave. "You ruined you. I just happened to be the one person in your life who was paying close enough attention to notice exactly how you do it." She walked out without looking back, the way she had learned to do a long time ago, back when she was 19 years old, watching her grandfather teach her that real power rarely announces itself. It waits patiently, in the margins of documents nobody else bothers
to read. For the exact moment someone underestimates it one time too many. 2 years later, the treatment Weston once tried to steal and sell for a quick, desperate payday became one of the most significant autoimmune breakthroughs of the decade, changing outcomes for thousands of children who would never know the names Marsh or Whitlock, and would never need to. Adrienne Whitlock rarely spoke publicly about the collapse of her marriage. When asked, in one of her only interviews, what advice she'd give to anyone facing a similar betrayal, she offered a single sentence that quietly went viral among business students for years afterward. "Never assume the people you underestimate haven't already read the paperwork you never bothered to." Somewhere behind federal prison walls, Weston Marsh was still learning, slowly and painfully, exactly what that sentence meant: that the ground beneath an empire can shift without a sound, if you've spent your entire life too arrogant to check who's really standing on it with you. He signed away a marriage that day in October, certain he was walking free. He never once imagined he was actually signing away the only thing he'd never questioned: the very ground his empire stood on, quietly owned, all along, by the woman he'd spent 17 years underestimating.